prevailing winds. And so we were being blown into the reef a little bit, and it was starting to pick up a chop. So we had to get out of there. We had to start that engine. Sailing through those coral heads upwind was not an option. So we started to look into what those options were. And the thing was, Dulcinea had a 3-cylinder Volvo engine that weighed maybe 800 or 900 pounds, and it had a heavy flywheel on it. It had compression releases and a couple of hand cranks. And the idea was that you would crank those hand cranks around as fast as you could with the compression releases open. And when the thing was going as fast as you could, you'd close the compression releases and the engine would kick over a couple of revs and the engine would start. But Dulcinea was a center cockpit boat. And that meant that it was right directly over the engine and quite close to it. And the engine was down in the keel of the boat, where it could have a straight line out through the prop shaft out the back of the keel. And furthermore, it had an engine room that was closely built around it, rather heavily built for insulation purposes. And like they do in boats, they screw and glue all the fixtures so that they don't vibrate apart and through the stresses on the boat, which is any boat is constantly flexing. So we had to break the engine room apart, with hammers and anything available. And I'd brought a few tools along with me, and so we took that boat apart. It had 2 hand cranks on it, one on either end, and on one end it was a smaller hand crank, and it was placed in such a position that, you could kind of reach your hand in there and do something like that. But that's not what we were talking about with starting a diesel like that. We were talking like this, and there's hardly room to squat over this engine. So Carlos, who was more brain than brawn, pretty quickly ended up being in charge of the compression releases, and I was in charge of the crank. And I would do that. I'd put everything I could into it, just getting it going. And I'm actually more like this, because I'm hitting my head on the top of the cockpit, or the bottom of the cockpit, and just like going like hell. And then Carlos would hit the compression releases, and every joint and every muscle in my body would come to like an immediate and percussive stop, which I tried that a half a dozen times with about a half an hour break in between each one, and I gave up. It was too much. It just I was in pain, and so we started to look for other options. Now, remembering that I'd brought all of my earthly possessions from Indiana and put it on that boat. I had LP records and a stereo player. I had a few tools. I had all my clothing. I had general knickknacks and junk that were mementos or what have you. And we took inventory, and among which I found a bag of loose change. What else are you going to do with it? You don't want to throw it away. So it was my stuff, so there it was on the boat. Most of it was pennies. And Carlos had the idea, a physicist, that we should take aluminum foil out of the kitchen and the pennies and immerse them in seawater as an electrolyte to try and create a battery to charge the batteries on the engine and start the boat. Now, we did that. We took a light bulb from the nav system, which had a wattage printed on it, and that was our way of measuring how much electricity we would get out of that and how long it would take to charge the battery. And with the pennies and stuff, it worked. It kind of had a very dull red glow, which was obviously not going to charge those batteries. And so we looked further, and I ended up taking the water pump out of the plumbing system for the boat, which was had a permanent diesel or permanent magnet electric motor on it. And I took a grinder, a hand-cranked grinder that I had inherited from my grandfather, and clamped that onto the dining room table, carved a groove in the middle of it with a hard piece of metal to serve as a large pulley, and took a knob off of the stereo, which happened to serve as a small pulley that happened to fit exactly over the shaft of that permanent magnet motor. And again, we pull out the wires and the electric, the light bulb, and we hook those up, and we cranked like hell, and it actually glowed very brightly. And so we hooked it up, and Carlos, we did that thing. Carlos did the math on it, and he found that it would actually be possible to charge those batteries by his estimation, but it would take 7 days and nights of continuous cranking to do that. And bottles of rum notwithstanding, we felt like we should pursue other options. Now, the batteries on the boat weren't completely dead. They had enough juice to power the marine band radio and a few lights. And so we called the hotel on Agata, which, us being, let's see, about there in the middle of that reef, and the hotel being about there, that was about 20 miles. And meanwhile, there was a storm moving in, and the wind had shifted. So instead of coming this way, it was going this way. And that meant that both the wind and the seas were picking up a little bit, and there was quite a chop. So I loaded my batteries into this little plastic dinghy and a jug of drinking water, and I set out for the hotel on Atagata. We had called them, and they did tell us that they had a generator, and they'd be happy to charge up our batteries. So I started rowing. Now, after about 4 miles, or not 4 miles, 4 hours of rowing, I'd pretty much removed all the skin off of my hands with the oars. And so I tore up my T-shirt and improvised mittens, and which promptly became red, but at least it was something, and I continued rowing. That was 4 hours. 8 hours later, I was at the hotel. So, it was not a happy experience. The chop was quite aggressive, and I had to bail regularly and to keep from filling up the boat with water from the spray. But I made it. The thing that the hotel didn't tell me on the radio was that they had a generator, but they didn't run the generator all the time. And in fact, they only ran it once a day in the morning for like about 6 hours, and I was there at about 10 o'clock at night. So, the weather's picking up. Thinking about Carlos back there with reefs every which way, and if the sea's really kicked up, that boat's just going to get beat up. So, and I also didn't think to take, the $500 or whatever it was to, rent a night at the hotel. So I hopped in the boat and rowed back. Now, it wasn't as bad as it sounds, because it was actually, it's like 80 degrees, and it's night. It was pretty, and I was going downwind this time and with the swells. So I arrived somewheres in the middle of the night and went to bed. Now, I woke up the next morning, and we were getting set to send me back on the dinghy, because it was, by the time I rowed for another 12 hours, bloody hands notwithstanding, the batteries should be well charged, and then I could row back. But looking at my bloody hands and my arms were kind of tired, I decided to have one more go with that engine. And Carlos, it was still kind of urgent, because the storm was gradually picking up. Carlos had taken ropes while I was gone and run them to the various coral heads, which weren't very far, and tied them on. But ropes chafe, and if the swells got too big, then we we'd end up getting battered to death on these coral heads, and the boat would sink. Our lives weren't really in danger because, you know, we had a little boat. We could have rowed to the island. And, you know, probably if we'd, you know, called out a distress signal, somebody would have come and got us. But, you know, we were determined to get out of this ourselves. So I went back into that engine room to give it one more go. And while I had been rowing the other day, Carlos had actually been busy, and he had looked very carefully at that diesel. If we'd had a manual, it would have made a great deal of difference because they probably would have had instructions as to how to start that diesel. But Carlos looked, and he, through listening to air wheezing out of the holes in the compression releases and looking at and placing marks on the flywheel, because, you know, the idea was that you would get that spinning at the right time. And he'd figured out that it was going to be very important. Like if you just throw all the compression releases over at once or at the wrong time, then Jamie's joints are going to get ripped apart. You know, he'd mapped all this out and figured out where each cylinder was and made marks on the flywheel. And so this time, when I got there and cranked, he knew exactly when to close those compression releases. You know, this cylinder is in this position, that one's in that one, close that one, you know, and so on. And you're having to go this, and do that in precisely the right sequence. And meanwhile, I'm going like that with this whole thing, and these cylinders are doing this. So it's quite a trick, but we got it. And the engine started. As I recall, I decided to take a rope and hang it off the back of the boat, throw a life preserver out on it, and a